The morning sun slid between the pine trees as I pulled up to my cabin, the same one my grandfather built with his own hands. The air was crisp, the gravel crunched under my boots, and for the first time in weeks I felt peace. Until I saw the envelope. It was taped to my front gate, bright yellow, stamped in bold red letters. Notice of violation, $200 fine. I frowned, tearing it open. Unauthorized parking on HOA property, it read. HOA property? That didn't make sense. This was my land, every inch of it. I'd paid taxes on it for 20 years. My family had owned it for nearly 80. I scanned the bottom of the notice and saw the signature. Margaret Thornfield, HOA president. I sighed. I'd heard her name before, whispered in town like a curse. Margaret had a reputation for running the homeowners association like a military camp. She fined people for everything, a mailbox too tall, grass too long, even wind chimes too reflective. But she'd never dared come after me. Until now. When I walked up the drive, I saw her standing there. Perfectly pressed blouse, clipboard in hand, lips pursed so tight it looked painful. "Morning," I said. She didn't return the greeting. "You're in violation," she replied sharply. "That vehicle isn't authorized to park here." "This is my driveway," I said, my voice calm but steady. Margaret tilted her chin. "This cabin falls under HOA jurisdiction now. It's part of the Silver Pines community boundary expansion." I raised an eyebrow. Funny, I never signed anything. "You don't have to," she said coldly. The board voted unanimously. I could feel the anger rising, but I kept my tone measured. "You might want to check your records again. This land's been in my family since 1943. Margaret scribbled something on her clipboard. "Then perhaps your family should have read the community bylaws." She turned to leave, her heels snapping against the gravel. I called after her. "You're making a mistake." She didn't even glance back. "So are you," she said, stepping into her SUV with HOA enforcement painted across the side. The engine roared, dust rose, and just like that, the first shot in our war had been fired. I looked down at the fine in my hand. The ink had smudged where my thumb pressed into it. I wasn't angry, and not yet, but I knew something Margaret didn't. She thought she was dealing with just another homeowner. She had no idea what was buried under that bridge, or who really owned it. The next morning I woke to the sound of hammering. Not the soft, distant kind, but the metallic thud of steel meeting steel echoing across the valley. When I stepped out onto my porch, my stomach dropped. Down the hill near the creek, a group of HOA workers were installing metal barricades at both ends of my bridge, the only bridge connecting the main road to my property. And right in the middle of it all stood Margaret Thornfield, clipboard in hand, barking orders like a general at war. I walked down the path, boots crunching against frosted grass. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted across the creek. Margaret turned slowly, squinting against the morning light. "Good morning to you too," she said, tone dripping with smugness. "You can't block that bridge," I said. "That's the only access to my home." She smiled, just barely. "Actually, it's part of the Silver Pines beautification project. The board has determined that the bridge violates the HOA safety standards." "Safety standards?" I repeated, crossing the planks to stand just a few feet from her. "That bridge was inspected last year, solid as ever." Margaret raised her clipboard. "We don't recognize that inspection. You'll need to apply for a new one under our guidelines. Until then," she nodded toward the workers, "access is restricted." I stared at her, disbelief turning to quiet fury. "You do realize," I said slowly, "that bridge doesn't belong to Silver Pines, it belongs to me." Margaret's lips tightened. "You can't own public access infrastructure." I smiled faintly. "It's not public. My grandfather built that bridge in 1943 with his own hands and his own lumber. It's been part of our family's deed since before Silver Pines existed." For a moment, Margaret's expression flickered. Confusion, maybe even doubt, but she recovered quickly. "Then I suggest you take it up with the board," she said curtly. "Until then, this property is under HOA review." She turned to walk away, her heels clacking against the wood. I stared at the barricades, two metal gates welded into place, padlocked tight. "You're making a mistake," I said again. She didn't answer. That night I sat on my porch, watching the moonlight shimmer across the creek. My phone buzzed every few minutes, messages from neighbors asking if they'd still be able to cross the bridge to reach their homes. Margaret had blocked everyone. By morning, the community was in chaos and stranded, furious, desperate. But I didn't panic. because while Margaret was busy building barriers, I was preparing something else, something she didn't expect. I reached into my desk drawer, pulled out an old file folder labeled Walker Ranch Land Deeds. Inside it was every document my grandfather had kept: maps, surveys, ownership records, even a signed county deed confirming the bridge and the land it stood on were private family property. I smiled. Margaret wanted a war. She was about to find out what happens when you block a man from his own land. The courthouse smelled of old wood and colder justice. I hadn't been inside in years, but that morning, as I pushed open the heavy glass doors with a file of documents under my arm, it felt like stepping into the heart of the fight. Margaret was already there, and of course she was, sitting at the front row with two other HOA board members whispering like a trio of crows. She wore the same striped shirt, clipboard balanced on her knees like a shield. She didn't even try to hide her smirk when she saw me. "Mr. Walker," she said sweetly, "did you come to pay your fine?" I set my folder down on the bench beside me. "No," I said. "I came to return it." The clerk called us in before she could respond. Inside the hearing room, sunlight filtered through the blinds, dust swirling in the air. The judge, a gray-haired man named Harold Clemens, looked over his glasses at both of us. "I understand this is a matter of property access and HOA authority." Margaret jumped in immediately. "Yes, Your Honor. The defendant has repeatedly violated HOA codes by using an unsafe structure for community access." I raised an eyebrow. "Unsafe structure?" "It's my bridge," she spun toward me. "The Silver Pines Homeowners Association has jurisdiction over all access roads within the community boundaries." I opened my file and slid a document across the table. "That's where you're wrong." The judge picked it up, scanning the old parchment paper. "This appears to be a county deed. Dated 1943? "Yes, sir," I said. "My grandfather built the bridge that year. The land surrounding it has remained in the Walker family ever since. The HOA boundary stops 200 feet before the creek. This bridge lies entirely on private property." Margaret frowned, but she recovered quickly. "Your Honor, that deed predates the formation of Silver Pines. The bylaws do not override private ownership." The judge interrupted, his tone sharp. "Mrs. Thornfield, did you verify this boundary before enforcing fines or installing barriers?" Margaret hesitated. "We acted under assumption." The judge sighed, rubbing his temple. "Assumption is not ownership." For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock. I leaned forward. "Your Honor, I'm filing an emergency injunction to have those barricades removed. They're blocking access not only to my property, but to other residents as well. People are stranded." The judge nodded slowly. "You'll have your hearing this week." He looked at Margaret. "And until then, I advise the HOA to refrain from further actions on disputed land." Margaret's jaw clenched, her knuckles white around the clipboard. When the session ended, she approached me in the hallway. "You think you've won something here?" she said quietly. "You're not above the law." I met her glare. "No, but I know the law, and that's the difference." She leaned in, voice low. "You won't make me look foolish in front of this town." I smiled faintly. "You're doing that all by yourself." She turned sharply and stormed off, heels echoing down the hall. Outside, I took a deep breath of the cool autumn air. I should have felt triumphant, but I didn't. I knew Margaret. She wouldn't stop. Not after being embarrassed in public. And I was right. That night, headlights swept across my windows. I looked out and saw her SUV idling near the barricade. She was talking to someone, and a man in uniform, police. Margaret was escalating. And this time she wasn't coming after the bridge. She was coming after me. The night of the patrol cars. The sound of tires crunching gravel is one that sticks with you, especially when it happens after midnight. I stepped out onto the porch, barefoot, coffee mug still in my hand, and saw the blue and red lights flickering through the trees. 2 patrol cars, engines idling, and standing beside them, arms folded, was Margaret Thornfield, her expression sharp as glass. "Evening, Mr. Walker," she called out, voice slicing through the cool air. "You're trespassing." I laughed once quietly. "On my own land?" She raised her clipboard like it was a badge. "You're in violation of a cease and desist order from the Silver Pines. HOA, the board has decided to enforce a temporary property lockdown pending further inspection." The officer beside her looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am," he said under his breath. "We don't have jurisdiction on private land." Margaret shot him a look that could curdle milk. "This is community property," she said firmly. "You'll assist with the enforcement." I stepped closer, the porch light catching her face. "Margaret," I said, calm as ever, "I suggest you stop before you make things worse for yourself." She sneered. "You don't scare me, Mr. Walker. You can wave your little papers around all you want, but the HOA has rules. And rules don't bend for stubborn old landowners." I smiled faintly. "You're right, but laws don't bend for petty tyrants either." That did it. Her face went red, her hand tightening on the clipboard. "Officers, if he refuses to comply, you are to escort him off the premises." The younger officer shook his head. "Ma'am, with respect, he's right. This isn't HOA land. We can't remove him." Margaret's voice cracked like a whip. "You're disobeying a lawful order." "No," the officer replied. "We're following the law." For a second, no one moved. The air was still, the only sound the soft hum of the patrol engines. Then I spoke quietly but clearly. "Margaret, this bridge, this cabin, this land, it's not yours to control. You've overstepped and you know it." She glared at me. "You think a piece of paper will save you?" "No," I said. "A court will." Her expression faltered just long enough for me to see it, the flash of fear behind the fury. She turned abruptly, muttering something under her breath, and stormed toward her SUV. The door slammed so hard it echoed off the hills. The patrol cars followed her down the road, lights fading into the distance. I stood there for a long moment, the night suddenly quiet again. The next morning I called my lawyer. We filed the injunction before noon. By evening, word had spread. The HOA's president had been caught overstepping her authority, and half the town was whispering about it. Some were angry, others secretly amused. And while Margaret tried to rally her board, I prepared for the one thing she couldn't manipulate: a courtroom showdown under oath. As the sun set behind the ridge that night, I stood on the porch and looked toward the bridge, my bridge, now sealed off with chains and barriers. Tomorrow, I thought, those chains would break, but deep down I knew Margaret wouldn't go down quietly. She never did. The courthouse in Oak Ridge was small, a relic from another era. Old wood panels, brass lamps, the faint smell of paper and dust. I sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, hands folded as Margaret Thornfield marched in with her entourage of HOA board members. Clipboard in hand, eyes sharp and defiant. The judge, an older man with silver hair and a voice like gravel, adjusted his glasses. "Let's get to the matter at hand. Mr. Walker versus the Silver Pines Homeowners Association." Margaret stood, her tone dripping with confidence. "Your Honor, this individual has repeatedly violated community regulations, parked illegally, and obstructed a designated beautification zone." I said nothing. My lawyer slid a folder across the bench, photographs, deeds, and one old yellowed map. "Your Honor," he began, "this bridge, the one Mrs. Thornfield blocked, was built in 1943 by the plaintiff's grandfather. It lies fully within private property, recorded and registered. The HOA has no jurisdiction." The judge flipped through the papers, brow furrowing. Margaret leaned forward, trying to speak, but he raised a hand. "Mrs. Thornfield, is there any legal document granting the HOA authority over this land?" She hesitated. "Well, the community's expansion—" "Answer the question." Her voice dropped. "No, Your Honor." The room fell silent. The judge leaned back. "Then it appears you've unlawfully obstructed private access. I'm issuing an immediate injunction. All barriers are to be removed within 24 hours. Margaret's face went pale. "You can't be serious. This sets a dangerous precedent." The gavel struck once. "The only danger here is an HOA forgetting the limits of its power." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Margaret froze, her clipboard trembling in her hands. I met her eyes, and for the first time she looked small, not furious, just defeated. Outside, reporters waited. The autumn wind carried the scent of pine and rain as I stepped onto the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed, microphones pushed forward. "Mr. Walker, how does it feel to win?" one asked. I paused, glancing toward the horizon where the hills met the gray sky. "It's not about winning," I said quietly. "It's about reminding people that land, legacy, and law still mean something." That night I drove home. The chains were gone. The bridge was open. The air felt lighter, but the war Margaret started had left a mark. Her car was gone from the HOA office. The sign out front still read Silver Pines, but someone had spray painted across it in red, "Private Property." I parked by the porch, stepped out and looked toward the bridge, glistening in the moonlight, just as it had for 3 generations. As I crossed it, the boards creaked beneath my boots, the same sound my grandfather once heard. For a moment, I could almost feel his hand on my shoulder. "This land," I whispered, "is ours again." But from the dark woods beyond the creek, a car door slammed. A figure stood watching, clipboard glinting faintly under the moon. Margaret. She hadn't left. And as the engine roared to life, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far bigger,